Welcome to the Sacred Calling Podcast, where we explore the intersection of God's story and your journey. Join us as we seek to rediscover the joy of knowing and living your sacred calling in life and leadership.
Welcome to the Sacred Calling Podcast. I'm your host, John Studebaker, and this is part 2 on the recall of David. Last time, we introduced the concept of ministerial fatigue, the technical term for burnout. Then we examined the first form of fatigue, spiritual fatigue, which we said could be quite surprising. Who would think that someone in professional ministry might suffer from spiritual burnout? And we saw how that is the case. So please go back and watch part 1 of this episode to learn more about spiritual fatigue. In part 2, I really want you to catch these additional threats that could thwart your ministry and add to potential burnout. After that, we'll take a deep dive into Psalm 16, where we examine the stress that David experienced and how he recovered from that in all these areas of fatigue. The second form of ministerial fatigue is experienced by many pastors and Christian leaders, and that is social and relational fatigue, which can include marital fatigue. London and Wiseman, in their book Pastors at Risk, list 14 danger zones for the marriages of those in professional ministry, including sexual temptation, suffering children, lack of emotional support and affirmation, guilt for lack of family time, and emotional separation in marriage. The constant demand to meet the variety of needs of those outside the immediate family, along with a possible lack of strong boundaries, becomes an automatic setup for a strained marriage and family. And if there are expectations that the pastor has to be spiritual all the time, then the chances are he's not going to develop close friendships where people can actually see the reality of his life, his soul, his needs, let alone his sins. And this can get compounded if there's conflict within the church. So as a result, he's less available for his wife and his kids and for deep friendships. Barna found in his study that 80% of pastors believed that their ministry affects their family negatively. 80% of ministry spouses feel left out and unappreciated in their church. 81% felt that they had an insufficient time with their spouse. And 77% feel they don't have a good marriage. 70% don't have anyone they can consider a close friend. Olson and Grosh, in their research, explain it this way. While at church, he is reverend and seen as the spokesperson for God. But at home, he's just daddy who is never available to play. The pastor who is admired as a hero at church may be seen as something considerably less at home, and this sets up a negative feedback loop. The next area of potential burnout for those in ministry is emotional and mental fatigue, often as a result of a lack of margin. Dr. Richard Swenson authored the popular book Margin, where he explained that margin is the buffer zone between what we are currently experiencing in life and our reserves. He said that without margin, we lose the ability to deeply feel those things about which we are most concerned, such as our relationship with God, the needs of our families, our own pain and grieving. We also lose the ability to think clearly about how biblical and spiritual truth can be applied to our parishioners and in today's world. 40 years ago, Freudenberger discovered that in the helping professions, a persistent negative state of mind can develop. And this is characterized by exhaustion, or by a sense of reduced effectiveness, or by decreased motivation. We see this with the pastors who come to our oasis in Michigan. A few years ago, a missionary couple gotten so tired in their emotional lives that they were depleted. So they needed to spend some time in solitude, to slow down and learn to feel again, to journal, and to learn to relate to God on an emotional level, to learn the needs of their own soul. And this leads to the fourth area, vocational fatigue. And this occurs when there's a poor fit in one's ministry role in their church or organization, or by just trying to fit into every role in that organization. Perhaps that person, that pastor or missionary is trying to meet the expectations of certain people or of everyone. If you combine this with a lack of boundaries regarding time or people and their expectations and their needs, the result is overload. And so that minister ends up simply fulfilling an external function, just doing tasks, simply performing, rather than living out his unique internal design, which brings joy and energy. So this all sets the pastor up to become overloaded and stressed vocationally. Pastors at Risk also found that 80% of pastors in the USA will not be in ministry 10 years from now, and only a fraction of them will make it a long-term career. And they also found, on average, that seminary-trained pastors last only 5 years in their church ministry. Dr. Archibald Hart, a former professor of psychology, describes the sort of stress that many pastors experience on Monday after a demanding Sunday, when they have a long, continuous, and heavy adrenaline strain. He calls it post-adrenaline depression. And if not managed properly over the course of several years, this strain can easily lead to a deep vocational burnout. He states, in burnout, the victim becomes demoralized and knows things aren't going right. He begins to lose the vision he had for ministry. He loses hope. Hart adds, a person with burnout disengages from the main task, and a state of crushing discouragement, almost despair, sets in. Demoralization is a good way to summarize it. Well, these four factors of ministerial fatigue are closely interrelated, so that one area of our humanity, if affected, can deeply affect another area. Other major factors include lack of exercise and proper nutrition, insufficient mentoring, false expectations regarding ministerial success, unconfessed sin, or unresolved bitterness. And each aspect of burnout can be compounding. They deplete our energy and the time we need to develop or to maintain a high quality of life, what Jesus referred to as the abundant life in John chapter 10, verse 10. Now, in our ministry with the Oasis, we've discovered a bottom line regarding burnout. The victim experiences a lack of time and energy to develop and maintain one's most important ministry attribute, a high quality of life. Sufficient time to rest, time to reflect on one's life choices, time to evaluate and analyze one's values in light of everyday issues and relationships, the time for family and genuine friendships to develop, time for exercise and good nutrition, and especially time to grow in and to enjoy one's relationship with God. So this brings us now to the question of how can I begin to recover from ministerial fatigue? And here is where we turn to the example of David in Psalm 16. During my own burnout, I found the Psalms and the prayers within the Psalms to be vital in my own recovery. Psalm 16 became one of my favorites because it gave voice to myself in that place of fatigue and despair, as it has with many others. David may have been on the run at this time, or he was just lacking security, but he needed to receive the fullness of God's promises. It was probably written by David in a season of vulnerability, possibly while being pursued by Saul. And it incorporates all four aspects of burnout recovery, showing an excellent pattern for assertively confronting each aspect. So, this leads us to Psalm 16, verses 1 and 2. And I refer to this section, David looks up, his recovery from spiritual fatigue. So here, David meditates on God's names and his character. In verses 1 and 2, here's David's prayer. Preserve me, O God, for I take refuge in you. I said to the Lord, you are my Lord. I have no good besides you. So first, David looks up to God to preserve me. Here he is asking Elohim, the creator God, to have charge of his life during a time of despair. The word shamar means to watch or guard or protect, as a shepherd would watch over and restrain his sheep from danger. David knows this well as a shepherd. So when he seeks refuge in his creator, he knows what kind of protection God can provide. And David affirms here God is his ultimate place of safety. He then proclaims, you are my Lord, my Yahweh, my intimate Father. You know, Yahweh is the covenant-keeping God. This name shows us that he trusts in God's covenant, that God will sustain the covenant he made with David. This name implies security, a deep loving kindness, and care. In this name, David can find deep rest and shelter from all of his troubles. Now, Yahweh has called out to David many times before. He's experienced God's call on his life many times. So here, David blocks out all of their voices to hear that call again. Essentially, this is God's recall of David back into his love and security, and to hear this divine voice of safety once again. So here, David can release all his fears and anxieties. And you know, we too need to begin to call upon the Lord when we're personally in a time of burnout. We need to become acquainted with the Yahweh who cares deeply about our griefs and our troubles. You know, David states later in verses 10 and 11 that he stands before the Holy One, taking extended personal time in Yahweh's presence. So this entire psalm alludes to a slowing down to experience Yahweh's peace and love afresh. Then in verse 2, in calling the Lord good, David relinquishes any attempt to find goodness or righteousness from sources other than Yahweh. And such a relinquishing takes time. Christian leaders need time to lift their burdens until they are removed from their soul. You know, through journaling, writing your own psalm, voicing one's emotions to God, praying and consulting with others, the Spirit of the Lord will reveal the subtle or not so subtle ways that we've sought to find goodness or righteousness from ourselves or from other sources. When people come to our oasis, we help them to reestablish their vertical call, essentially their recall, by writing down a vertical calling statement, a purpose statement, so that everything they do on the horizontal plane in their mission, in their daily life, is oriented toward the vertical. It's done in the presence of God. They have to find that presence first and then make plans to establish the path of life in that presence so that they can abide in God's presence as they walk it out. In my own burnout, I started taking long walks with God in nature. I began to call out to God to be my recreator and my protector, to keep me safe. I began to inscribe long journal entries until I could declare, you are my Lord, and thereby allow him to sort out my distorted thinking. One of the first things we recommend to the Christian leaders who come to the Oasis is to spend a full day in the presence of God without distraction. We encourage them to journal, to think through what they've brought with them, anxieties or distractions, and then to pray through each one, to wander around, to pray deeply. They may need to get back into close touch with their own heart and their need for margin once again, and to turn to God's voice and to hear God speaking to them. So that is the first section of Psalm 16, verses 1 and 2, where David recovers from spiritual fatigue. Next time, we'll examine the other three aspects of burnout and how David recovers from all three of these. So be sure to catch part 3 of this episode on the recall of David. Now, before I close this out, let me just talk briefly about the BMI Oasis once again. We are offering now through the end of October, which is Pastor's Appreciation Month, a free Sacred Calling assessment. Just send us an email and let us know that you'd like to partake in the Sacred Calling assessment, where you'll just answer a few questions related to these 4 areas of fatigue, and then we'll spend some time on the phone or on Zoom discussing these questions and seeing where there might be a lack of margin in these 4 areas. And you can contact me through our email, sacredcalling@bmioasis.com. Thanks, and I look forward to seeing you next time. God bless.